Welcome students. Today we will study about endocrine system. This is unit 4 in the subject Human Anatomy and Physiology-II and the subject code is BP 201T. Myself Gitika Mehta, Assistant Professor in Rajkumar Goel Institute of Technology, Pharmacy, Ghaziabad. In this lecture, we will study about various endocrine glands, their hormones and how we classify these hormones and how these hormones act. So, their mechanism of action, their regulation and actions of hormone. So, let us start with endocrine system. So, what is endocrine system? So, endocrine system is made up of glands that produce and secrete hormones. So, endocrine system consists of glands and their hormones, and the study of endocrine system, their glands, their hormones, their disorder is known as endocrinology. So, begin with definition of hormones. So, what are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers that are secreted directly into the blood, which carries them to the organs and tissues of the body to exert their functions. So, what does that mean? That hormones are basically chemicals and these are secreted by special type of cells, and these cells they secrete hormones directly into the blood, and from blood these hormones goes to their target site, that is where they produce their action. It can be some organ, it can be gland or can be tissues. So, hormones are secreted by special type of cells into the blood, and from blood these goes to their target site to produce their action. So, hormones play very important role in our body. They are important in regulation of homeostasis to maintain the body internal environment. So, what are the functions of hormones? So, hormones they control growth and development. They control the growth of the body, muscles, skeletal muscles, they regulate the metabolism of the body and energy balance. They regulate reproductive functions, growth of the reproductive organs, release of the hormones, cognitive functions, they regulate our mood and they also maintain body temperature and regulate thirst. So, these are the important functions of hormones. Each hormone produce different type of functions and we will deal with their function and action in detail one by one. So, these are the major endocrine glands which are present in our body. So, starting with brain, we have hypothalamus, pituitary gland and pineal gland in the brain. Then we have thyroid gland in the neck region anterior to trachea. Then we have pancreas that secrete insulin, glucagon. Then adrenal glands which are present above the kidneys that secrete adrenal hormones, adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla are the parts of adrenal gland which secrete corticosteroids. Then ovaries and testes, ovaries in females and testes in males also produce male and female sex hormones. So, these are the important endocrine glands which secretes hormones in the body. Now, but these endocrine glands they cannot produce action or they cannot regulate homeostasis alone, that is not at their own. Nervous system and endocrine system they need to work together. They act together to coordinate all systems of body, that is nervous system and endocrine system work together to regulate homeostasis. But what is the difference between nervous and endocrine system? So, nervous system releases neurotransmitter. Nervous system releases neurotransmitter while endocrine system releases hormones. While endocrine system releases hormones. Hormones circulate through the blood and bind to the receptor on the target cell which are far from the site of release. In case of hormones, their target site is far from their site of release. They reach to the target site through the blood. So, in case of hormone, target site is far, but it comes in the nervous system. Neurotransmitters also bind to the receptors which are present on the target cell, but their target cell is close to the site of release. Their target cell is close to the site of release at the synapse where they form a junction, and it can be a muscle, gland or neurons. So, one big difference is their hormones, in case of hormone their target site is far, and in case of neurotransmitter their target site is close to the site of release. Another difference is in case of hormones they have slow onset, but longer duration of action. They have longer duration of action. In case of the hormones, their onset is slow, that is it can take seconds, minutes or hour, but its action is for longer duration. In case of the neurotransmitter, they produce immediate action within the milliseconds, onset within the milliseconds, immediate action and shorter duration of action, that is their action terminates easily. Shorter duration of action, short duration of action hai, they have slow onset, they have fast onset. They have fast onset, they are longer duration of action, they are of shorter duration of action. So, these are the few basic differences between the nervous system and endocrine system, but both systems they are important to regulate homeostasis. They are important to regulate homeostasis. So, next going further, now there are the two types of the glands present in our body, exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands, they secrete their products into ducts. None of these are the hormones. Exocrine glands directly secrete their secretions into the ducts, but these are not hormones, their secretions are not hormones. What does they secrete? They secrete sweat from the sweat glands, they secrete oil from the oil glands, they secrete digestive juices from the digestive glands. So, these are the exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, as I have already mentioned, they secrete hormones, but they are ductless. These are ductless because they do not secrete their hormones in the any duct. They directly secrete into the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, hormones enter into the blood and blood carries these hormones to the target cell, and where they produce their action. So, this is the difference between exocrine gland and endocrine gland. So, in this diagram we have shown how endocrine reaches to its target site, how hormones reaches to its target site. So, this is the cell, endocrine cell that produces and secretes hormone, that produces and secrete hormone. So, this is hormone. So, hormone is secreted by the endocrine cell by exocytosis, by exocytosis. And then, and what is this? This is interstitial fluid. This is interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid, that is the fluid that surrounds the cell. So, interstitial fluid, the hormone is secreted into the interstitial fluid, and from interstitial fluid it goes into the blood, into the blood capillaries, and through the blood it goes to the target site. This is the target cell or target tissue, and on the target cell they have receptors. So, hormones from the blood goes to the target site, binds with the receptor and produces its action. So, hormone first step is releases from the cell, goes into the interstitial fluid, enters inside the blood, from blood, and the site of release is distant, is far away from the target cell, and at the target cell it has its receptor where hormone binds with the receptor and produces action, and produces action. So, because this hormones are entering inside the blood, so they are known as circulating hormone because they reaches to target site by entering into the blood or through the blood. There are other types of hormone which are known as local hormones. Local hormones do not circulate, that is they do not go to their target site through the blood. So, these are called as local hormone. Either they act on the same cell from where they are produced, or they act on the nearby target cell. So, hormones are released and then they go through the interstitial fluid to the nearby cell, and there they produce their action by binding to the receptors on nearby cell. So, when they produce action on nearby cell, then they are known as paracrine hormone. Then they are known as paracrine hormone, and when these hormones are released and act on their own cell from where they are released, जहाँ से रिलीज हुए वहीं पे वो एक्शन प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं, then they are known as autocrine hormones. So, hormones, local hormones, they act either on the same cell that secrete them, then they are known as autocrine, or they act on the neighboring cell, then they are known as paracrine hormones. So, going further, now we will classify hormones. So, hormones can be classified in two groups, group 1, group 2, based on their solubility, based on their nature. So, on the basis of their solubility, hormones are divided into lipophilic hormones and water soluble hormone, that is lipid soluble and water soluble hormones. So, lipid soluble hormones are mainly derived from the cholesterol. They are mainly derived from the cholesterol, and these hormone binds to the intracellular receptor. Intracellular receptor means that the receptors for the lipophilic hormones are present inside the cell. They are present inside the cell. Example of the lipid soluble hormones are steroids like glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoid, estrogen, androgen and thyroid hormone, both T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, both are thyroid hormones. So, next is group 2, that is water soluble hormones. Water soluble hormones because they are water soluble. They cannot cross plasma membrane, but to produce their action they need to bind with the receptors. So, receptors for water soluble hormones are present on the cell surface. They are present on the cell surface and they stimulate release of the secondary messengers. So, examples are amines, peptides like human growth hormone and insulin. These are few examples of water soluble hormones. Now, basis on their composition and basis on their chemical structure, we divide hormones into steroidal hormones, amine hormones, peptide hormones, protein hormones, glycoproteins and eicosanoids. So, first is steroid hormones because they are basically derived from the cholesterol. For example, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, aldosterone, cortisol, androgen, etc. So, these are the steroidal hormone because they are and these are the lipid soluble, they are derived from the cholesterol. Amine hormones, they are made up of amines. Amines hormones is derivative of the mostly tyrosine. They are derived from the amino acid tyrosine, T3, T4, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are derived from the tyrosine. Histamine, which is a local hormone, is derived from the amino acid histidine, from the histidine, and histamine is stored in the mast cell. Peptide hormone, short chain of linked amino acid. So, it consists of the short chain of linked amino acid, for example, oxytocin and vasopressin. Protein hormones consist of long chain of amino acid, for example, insulin and glucagon, and as you know, insulin and glucagon both are released from the pancreas. Glycoprotein, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. So, and eicosanoids, these are the local hormones again, these are derived from fatty acid, these are derived from the arachidonic acid, these are derived from the arachidonic acid. Examples are prostaglandins and leukotrienes. So, these are the classification of the hormones based on their chemical structure. So, now coming to the mechanism of action of lipid soluble hormones, that is very important, how hormones produce their action. So, need to understand it clearly. So, lipid soluble hormones like example are steroid hormone and thyroid hormones. So, hormones first from the interstitial fluid they enter inside the blood, and from the blood lipid soluble hormones goes to the cell, and now first to produce its action on the target cell, hormones announce their arrival. How do they announce their arrival? To announce their arrival, they need to bind with their receptors. So, lipid soluble hormones bind to receptors and their receptors are present inside the cell. Receptors for lipid soluble hormones are present inside the cell. If they are present inside the cytoplasm, then they are known as cytoplasmic receptor, for example, steroid, and if they are present inside the nucleus, then they are called as nuclear receptor. Thyroid hormone is the example. So, hormone enters inside the cell by simple diffusion. This is the receptor. Hormone binds with the receptor and alter the gene expression, and this DNA will form the new mRNA, and mRNA will This newly formed mRNA direct the synthesis of new proteins on the ribosomes, and these new proteins, these proteins can be enzymes. These proteins alter the cell activity, they produce physiological responses of these lipids soluble on the target cell. So, lipid soluble hormones receptors are present inside the cell. It can be inside the cytoplasm, it can be inside the nucleus, and thus they produce their action by binding to their receptors. Water soluble hormones, because they cannot cross the cell membrane, so their receptors are present on the cell surface. These are the integral receptors for water soluble hormones are integral transmembrane proteins. So, this is G protein coupled receptor. As soon as hormone binds with the receptor, G protein gets activated. It further activates adenyl cyclase enzyme. Adenyl cyclase convert ATP into cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP act as second messenger, that is further pass on the information. How? So, this cyclic AMP act as the second messenger to activate protein kinase enzyme. This protein kinase enzyme causes the phosphorylation of the various proteins. It causes phosphorylation of the various cellular proteins, and these phosphorylated protein ultimately produces action of water soluble hormones, and these phosphorylated protein either will stimulate the action or it will inhibit the action depending upon the enzyme that gets activated. So, there are the number of protein kinases present which produces phosphorylation of the various proteins and enzymes, and that result in the action of the water soluble hormones. So, this was mechanism of action. Next is hormone interaction. So, to produce hormone their action, hormones should be receptor should be present on the cell or inside the cell, or hormones should be released in the sufficient quantity, and thirdly hormone itself affect the others hormone action. So, this type of action is, it can be permissive, it can be synergistic or antagonistic. So, one hormone can affect other hormone action by these types. So, what is permissive? When action of one hormone on target cell require simultaneously exposure of other hormone, then it is permissive. For example, for the growth and metabolism, thyroid and growth hormone both are important. For the synergistic, that is when the effect of two hormones acting together is greater or more than the effect of each hormone acting alone. For example, for the development of oocytes, FSH from the anterior pituitary and estrogen from the ovary both are required. So, it is synergistic action, that is when action of one hormone is not sufficient. Antagonistic, when one hormone opposes opposite action produces, when one hormone opposes the action of another hormone. For example, insulin lowers blood glucose level and glucagon increases blood glucose level. So, this is how hormones interact. So, next is regulation of hormone secretion. So, to maintain the homeostasis, hormones should be present neither in the excess nor in the less amount. So, it is important to regulate the secretion of hormones to prevent overproduction or underproduction of the hormone. And how does it regulate it? Either from it regulated by the nervous system or to the chemical changes in the blood, that is change in the pH, changes in the blood volume, changes in the concentration ion like calcium ion itself regulate the release of the parathyroid and calcitonin hormone and other hormones like we discussed in the previous slide. So, nervous system, chemicals and other hormones control the secretion of other hormones. So, basically it is regulated by negative feedback system that controls the secretion of many hormones, that is overproduction of hormone will inhibit the release of the stimulating hormone. This negative feedback system of hormones we will study in detail in further lecture. So, this was basic introduction of the hormones in which we studied different types of hormones, their classification and their basic mechanism of lipid soluble and water soluble hormones and how they produce their action by binding to their receptor. So, these are the references. You can go through these books for the further reading, and thank you.